Listen closely and do not look away, for this is where curiosity becomes obligation and men learn what silence has been hiding. You are not being offered a casual story but an initiation into the kind of truth that rearranges how you think about duty and neglect. Mark arrived with a camera and the stubbornness of someone who seeks what others bury. He was warned not to go, but warnings are often the last polite tools a town uses to keep its secrets intact. What he discovered was not merely poverty, it was an architecture of abandonment built over generations where every absence became a rule and every rule hardened into ritual. The Whittakers lived inside a loop where bloodlines folded back on themselves and kinship ceased to be a relation and became a function. Twins married cousins, cousins married cousins, and the circles multiplied until identity itself blurred into obligation. At the center stood a man named Timmy, whose body and mind bore the geometry of that closed system and whose face became the map of a town that had looked the other way. Mark did not arrive with solutions, he arrived with attention, and attention acts like a mirror, it forces neighborhoods to confront what they tolerated for decades. This first revelation is not sensational, it is structural, it is the recognition that when institutions retreat, poverty and isolation will invent their own rules, and those rules can become prisons. No school records, no medical checks, no official births, just oral memory and a careful forgetting by a county that preferred peace to probing. Think about what that means for accountability. Think about how a ledger that is blank can hide a pattern of harm as easily as any forged signature. The Whittakers were both victims and evidence of a system that disinvests people until their lives become anomalies to be gawked at online. Do not mistake compassion for spectacle, and do not let shock replace responsibility. Mark's photograph cracked the shell that had protected the family, and in that crack light revealed the first of 7 truths that will follow through this series. This opening is a lesson in perception and consequence that asks you to notice how neglect becomes normalized, how neighbors collude with silence, and how a single image can force institutions to answer questions they long avoided. If you remain with this story, you will be asked to feel the weight of what was permitted and to recognize that some wounds begin with omission and end with a demand for justice. Now you must learn the second lesson and understand how a town becomes the instrument of a family's conspiracy of neglect. This is not about simple malice but about systems that calcify over generations and become invisible because everyone benefits from their invisibility. Listen as I walk you through how neighbors, bureaucrats, and local leaders folded around this family until truth could not breathe. First, the omission. Small moments of indifference stacked like shingles on a roof. A missed school registration here, an unchecked illness there, a ledger item left blank because paperwork is tedious and compassion is optional. Those empty boxes became cover for a practice that required silence to survive. Second, the economy. Poverty cultivates a quiet code. If you are dependent on a community that also depends on silence, you learn to trade your questions for peace. A farmer drops a sack of corn at a gate and never asks why it is accepted. The postman glances toward the house and looks away. These are transactions of neglect that bind a town tighter than law. Third, institutions. Social services and clinics are only as effective as they are invited, and the Whittakers were peripheral and the county's focus. Resources flowed to downtown projects and for a family in a fold of hills. Bureaucracy translated into absence. When reporters knocked, they met rehearsed denial. When a teacher filed a concern, it sank into unprioritized forms. It is not always conspiracy, sometimes it is the patient entropy of public attention being diverted elsewhere. Fourth, the psychology. Isolation breeds mythology. The family becomes a cautionary tale and then a legend, and legends excuse restraint. People invent reasons to avoid confronting what they sense. They whisper that intervention will harm them more. Fifth, the power of narrative. Whoever controls the story controls action. The Whittakers were framed as curiosities, then caricatures, and once the conversation became ridicule, it lost moral force. Sixth, the moral calculus. When a community decides that exposure is cruelty and silence is kindness, the result is complicity dressed as mercy. This is how neglect becomes architecture, how small agreements compound into a system that protects harm and punishes curiosity. Carry this with you. The lesson here is structural, not merely personal. Learn this and act in the next section we will go deeper into the rituals and the private language that kept the family locked away. Now we go beyond silence and neglect into the private mechanisms that held a family captive. This is the anatomy of control, and it is quieter and more durable than you think. First, the rituals begin. Small repeated acts that accrue sacred weight. A mealtime blessing held too long, a bedtime oath given the seriousness of a covenant. Then those acts become curriculum. Children are taught to stand at a precise hour, to fold hands in a particular way, to perform gestures that interrupt play and normalize obedience. Ritual builds predictability, and predictability becomes containment inside a system that wants to remain closed. Second, the private language. It is not merely speech but a grammar of obedience, words that map to actions and punishments, phrases that cue silence and compliance. When outsiders ask questions, the children answer with the family syntax, like parrots trained to heed a bell. To the clan, the language proves the outside cannot be trusted because only we possess the words that justify survival. Third, the architecture of secrecy. Closed shutters, a locked cupboard, a basement kept dark. These are props for an invisible curriculum that instructs who matters and who does not. Fourth, the mythic frame. Ancestral tales rewritten into doctrine, a grandfather recast as visionary, not tyrant. Sacrifice turned into salvation. Myth polishes guilt into duty, and duty is harder to resist than mere moral outrage. Fifth, the enforcement network. Not always violence, sometimes chores that exhaust a child into compliance. Repetition of shame until internal submission replaces external restraint. The family trains judges and jailers in soft voices. Sixth, the transactional economy. Small favors exchanged with outsiders, groceries left by the road, a repaired tractor, a discreet payment to look the other way. Every kindness becomes a link in the cage. Finally, the psychology. These systems are adaptive, designed to survive scrutiny, to turn intervention into threat. A rescuer without planning becomes an aggressor in the eyes of those who are dependent on the pattern. Understand this and you learn why exposure is messy, why rescue often fractures rather than frees, and why some interventions bind survivors tighter to the system than before. Hold that understanding, because the next section will show how public attention reshaped the family into something new and dangerous. Stay with me. This is not spectacle, it is an examination of how power hides inside family rituals. You have watched the mechanism spin and the trap close. Now you will see what happens when the light of exposure hits a family built on secrecy, and the light is not a cure, it is a catalyst. Public attention functions like a second ritual. It rewrites identity faster than any family tradition could, and it comes with its own economy of power. Cameras become altars, clicks become currency, and the family becomes a spectacle to be consumed. When outsiders arrive, the first thing they break is distance. Then they break the code that kept a system coherent, and that fracture reveals more than abuse, it reveals complicity. Institutions that looked away for convenience or fear. Hospitals file notes that vanish, courts accept convenient explanations, neighbors rehearse amnesia, and agencies arrange themselves into plausible deniability. This is not negligence only, it is also a strategy communities deploy to preserve a version of peace that depends on silence. Then comes the legal theater. Investigators arrive with protocols and paper, yet they carry assumptions that blind them to the deeper pattern. This is why the first wave of intervention so often fails, because it treats symptoms like a crime scene, not a culture. Children are removed and separation looks like salvation, but separation can rip the anatomy of survival out from a child who learned to survive inside a collective logic, and the unintended consequence is identity collapse. Agencies scrambled to fix what they did not understand, and professional language turned suffering into diagnoses that erased history. Now watch how power redirects blame to protect itself. Experts argue about method, and the town demands closure so the public record will say the problem is solved, when in fact it has migrated into quieter forms. It morphs into foster placements that re-traumatize, it moves into medical labels that silence stories, and it buries evidence in bureaucratic files. At the center of this collapse lies a choice every witness faces: to speak or to shield, and the default is to shield because shielding is safe and speaking is risky, and risk demands sacrifice. This is why revolutions of truth are rare, because truth asks people to break the pact that kept them comfortable. If you are still with me and you want to make a mark on what comes next, comment the phrase "I see beyond" twice in the comments. Now do it exactly like that as a sign that you will not walk away silently. This locks an identity with the algorithm and with yourself. When you return from the comments, we will trace the exact ways institutions reroute responsibility and the secret networks that take over when visibility threatens them. You have chosen to watch, now choose to act, because watching without consequence is how systems endure. Now the truth moves from discovery into consequence, and you must understand how damage becomes durable when systems choose comfort over courage. The town wants narrative closure, officials want paperwork, while the family simply tries to survive. Legal measures arrive: subpoenas, custody decisions, forensic reviews, translating human suffering into forms that bureaucracies can process. Those forms satisfy institutions but rarely repair people because institutions are designed to close cases, not to carry generational trauma forward with care. Psychologists assign diagnoses, social workers file plans, judges sign orders, each action an attempt to render the problem legible to systems that fear ambiguity. In practice, this means children are dispersed, siblings separated into foster placements that provide safety but not identity, and treatments become protocols rather than practices rooted in story. Think of it as a wound wrapped in sterile gauze that hides infection beneath. The visible fix masks the deeper rot. Real restoration requires truth-telling, ritual change, community accountability, and sustained investment, and those things require long-term commitment. Complicity scales through small compromises, neighbors who trade silence for safety, businesses that omit questions for stability, officials who normalize oddities to avoid trouble, and over decades these choices calcify into culture. External actors bring heat: journalists, activists, philanthropists. They generate attention and funds, but they also bring extraction, headlines, and the risk of redefining survivors in the language of spectacle. Sustained healing needs local capacity, training for caregivers, community-led reparations, and programs that honor memory while building new skill sets. Without this, interventions produce secondary harm, children become distrustful of help, communities harden, and the pattern simply reproduces itself in new forms. You must view the system as an artifact of incentives and risk aversion that prefers closure over repair. To change outcomes, you must change those incentives, create mechanisms that reward truth-telling, fund long-term guardianship programs, and build local institutions with the mandate to repair rather than simply respond. This work happens away from cameras, in budget meetings, in trainings, in the slow daily practice of listening with consequence. If you remain watching now, you are part of the solution because witnessing without action is consent. Speak to your elected officials, support sustained local programs, fund training for long-term caregivers, and resist the urge to reduce these lives to a single viral moment. That is how durable change begins. Take action now. The hidden structures reveal themselves, the quiet networks and the soft collusions that let darkness widen without dramatic headline. First, there is the rhetoric of normalcy, the language communities use to avoid shame, phrases that stop investigation before it begins. Next comes the labor of omission, small acts that build systems, neighbors who look away for plausible reasons, officials who file forms but do not follow up, clinicians who note risk but have no resources to act. Then there is the economy of complicity, the way money and attention flow away from costly long-term repair, how budgets prioritize one-time fixes and crisis response over sustained restoration. You will see how institutions externalize cost, placing the burden of recovery on families and local charities while structural responsibility dissolves. Consider the role of archives, the controlled histories, sealed files, and redacted reports that create official amnesia, records that are legal but not truthful. These mechanisms protect institutions from scandal while leaving survivors to navigate rubble. There is a political calculus too, the election cycles that reward immediate action and punish the slow work of reconciliation, the lawyers and insurers who constrain remedies into boxes they can control. In every case the result is similar, systems that appear to act but that in practice maintain status quos that benefit the comfortable. This is how trauma becomes generational, because it is not only transmitted in blood and behavior, it is reinforced by law, custom, and administrative choices. Now imagine a different path, a design that interrupts repetition, a framework that centers survivors and forces institutions to carry obligation. Begin with transparency, unsealing records with safeguards and public oversight so truth can be acknowledged without spectacle. Next, create funded guardianship models, long-term caretakers paid and trained to honor memory while building skill and autonomy. Design restorative processes, community truth forums that do not replace courts but that lay moral foundations for reparation and new norms. Change incentives, tie funding to outcomes that measure social repair rather than case closure, reward municipalities that invest in long-term care and community reintegration. Train professionals to listen for lineage patterns and to resist simple narratives, and build research networks that publish responsibly and that protect subject dignity. Prioritize local leadership, because outsiders who parachute and create dependency, while local actors can transform culture from within. Most important, remember the human shape of this problem, that behind every sealed file there is a life that must be tended, and that repair requires patience, sacrifice, and sustained courage. If you want to prevent the next Hollow Ridge, the next Dalton, you must demand systems that do not merely respond, but that refuse to forget. The final chapter comes not as an ending but as a charge to act. What you have seen is a proof of what silence builds when communities choose comfort over confrontation. This is the moment where names matter, where records matter, where the faces we met must be given back their lives through systems that do not forget. Survivors need stability, not spectacle, long-term care, not brief headlines, legal acknowledgement, not buried files. Begin with truth, open sealed records with appropriate safeguards, fund dedicated centers for those damaged by generational isolation, and pathways for identity restoration and medical follow-up. Train professionals to notice the pattern, not just the incident. Teach social workers to read the signs of lineage abuse in clandestine families. Update protocols so a postal worker's concern triggers a multi-agency response, not a shrug. Protect whistleblowers with legal shields so neighbors can speak without fear of retribution. Change policy so institutions that fail vulnerable people face enforceable remediation plans and public accountability. Invest in rural mental health and mobile clinics so isolation no longer hides suffering. Mandate transparency when a property repeatedly generates welfare complaints and allow courts to appoint neutral guardians when secrecy endangers children. Journalists have a role too, to report and partner with advocates who can transform attention into durable help. This is not charity, this is justice, and justice requires structures that outlast virality. If you were moved by the stories, then act in 2 concrete ways now. First, support organizations that provide long-term care and legal help to survivors of familial abuse and isolation. Second, pressure your representatives to fund rural social services and to create legal tools for unsealing records when public safety demands it. If you are watching and you want to anchor your intent, comment the phrase "I remember I witnessed" twice in a row to signal commitment and to help the algorithm surface accountability. This small act is symbolic, but symbols shape habit and habits shape institutions. Remember that secrecy is a technology, and exposure without repair is cruel. Do not consume this story as entertainment, convert it into a practice of responsibility, of sustained attention, of policy change. You were brought here by curiosity, but you must leave as a guardian of the truth. Hold memory for those who were forced to forget and refuse to let the next generation inherit silence today.